I volunteered to give some advice on academic writing, so it's a more general topic. And my motivation in doing so was that I got advice on this when I was a PhD student, and so I should give proper attribution. A large part of this presentation is based explicitly on advice given to me as a graduate student when I was at the University of Rochester, some by Bill, some by Jarrad Harford. And the other part of the motivation is I got this advice. I found it extremely useful, and also I read a lot of papers that have indicated to me that there are a lot of people who aren't getting this advice, that this advice is not being disseminated. And so it seemed like this was a good opportunity to give this advice. And also I think it'll help you with what, we've talked a little bit about how you have to be persistent in this profession. And you have to be able to take rejection. And it's sort of the way my colleague John Karpoff sums up this problem. He calls it the 10,000 day problem. That, so let's say you have a 30-year career and you work for over 10,000 days. People would consider it a successful career, one in which you get 10 A publications. That would be a very successful career. So in 10,000 days, you can have 10 good days. And so you have to, hopefully, if you have to be able to handle that. That's, there are a lot of careers where that is sort of the norm, And so if you get better at writing, you've got good ideas, you've done good research. If you get better at writing it up, then hopefully one of those good days will happen earlier in your career because you won't be on such this learning curve. And that makes it easier to sort of deal with the fact that you're only going to have 10 good days in 10,000. So good papers, we talked a lot about research and research ideas that are going on, but part of what makes a good paper is that it's readability. That's part of quality. The quality is in the idea, but it's also in the readability, your ability to get this idea across to people, and that realistically does influence the impact of the paper. And so one way you can help a little bit with the impact of the paper is to avoid the tendency to write for an expert audience, avoid the tendency to write for an audience of people who work exactly in your area and who know exactly everything that's going on in your area. And instead, so write for a doctoral student audience. That's not to say, I'm not using you as sort of people who don't know anything. I'm saying you know a fair amount, and that's a good. You don't want to shoot too low. You want to shoot for people who understand the field of finance, but that aren't sort of right on top of everything that you and the few people you work with are doing. And more than one person today has talked about the introduction, and so I'm going to talk about it as well because I think we all sort of agree it's important. So I can't remember who exactly once told me the sort of 50% rule, that you'll spend half of your time writing the entire paper you'll spend on the introduction, even though it's obviously not half the length of the paper. And I think that's realistic. Sometimes you just rip your introduction apart and rewrite it from scratch. And it was mentioned earlier that a lot of people form an opinion by the time they're done with the introduction. And I think if you're going to be realistic, a lot of referees also sort of starting to form an opinion by the time they're done with the introduction, and they may sort of start to be on your side or sort of against you by the end of the introduction. If they're on your side, they're sort of looking for you're not facing as uphill battle. If they're sort of starting to form an opinion against the paper by the time of the introduction, then they're sort of starting to look for reasons to kill the paper, which every paper has reasons to kill it, so it's an easy thing to do. Bill gave this advice, how many years ago it was I was there, so at least he's still very consistent. You need to think about what's the hook in your paper and get it across in the introduction. Why should, pick your favorite famous person, Mike Lemon or something like that, read this paper and go from there. You have to have the hook. And part of this, maybe we want to say, oh, we're pure scientists, and part of this is selling. You need to sell your idea and make it clear why it's important. Don't just assume that it's self-evident why this is the greatest paper on earth. And that comes with the contribution. It should be evident by the time you're done with the introduction. Don't assume it's evident to a reader at the start. You want to be looking for how does you want to be you want to be attacking big picture questions. You know, we're not just looking at sort of methodological changes stuff. Relate what you're doing to the big picture questions in finance, and that'll make it easier to make clear what your contribution is. But at the same time, don't oversell. I mean, you don't want to oversell what you're doing, so then you don't actually deliver it. The results section. By the time your reader gets here, she should understand what you're doing and why. And so, you know, I've read papers that sort of skip completely over a hypothesis development section. You know, they go right to the data and the results, and then they're trying to sort of develop the hypotheses as they go through the results section, and that just becomes a total jumbled mess. And as part of the results section as well, don't just read the tables to the reader. All right, we can read the tables, so don't just sort of read us through line by line and tell us every result that's in the table and every coefficient that's in the table. Instead, you should have already established, you know, what your hypotheses are and why your test that you're going to execute makes sense to test those hypotheses. So that by the time you get to the results, you don't have to read the results of the table. You can discuss the results in the context of the hypotheses and how they either support or reject the hypothesis. Get lots of feedback. All right. Submission flow is sort of way up, even from when most of us started. And so a lot of papers are getting submitted to journals. And so you should take every opportunity to get your paper vetted as much as possible before it gets to the journal. And you know, there's sort of obvious signals of this to an editor when they receive a paper at a journal. If the acknowledgments are sort of absent or fairly short, it indicates that the person has not sort of properly vetted this paper. None of other people have read this paper, given comments, contributed to it. It hasn't been presented anywhere, stuff like that. And so this is a collaborative profession. And this doesn't, once you become, you know, an assistant professor, you should take advantage of your colleagues and impose a little bit on your senior colleagues' time as well. Part of their job is to mentor you. But right now, take advantage of your fellow doctoral students. I mean, I know I did. It was part of the culture within the classes around me at Rochester was that we were very active in reading each other's stuff, partly because we were terrified of giving work to our professors that hadn't sort of been vetted amongst each other, but partly because we knew that was how we were all going to get better, and that also helped us going forward. You know, I still have friends from the doctoral program that we basically said, you know, anytime you need a quick read, we'll be there to sort of give you a quick feedback on a paper. So, you know, make use of your colleagues. All right, so some general advice on topics. Read a financial newspaper. I think, you know, hopefully I'm not going to get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Bill once said that the best journal to read for research ideas is the Wall Street Journal. At least that's where I got my dissertation topic. And you know, this is, you know, we talked about the difficulties of being in a social science versus being in physical sciences. We can't sort of create experiments, right, and stuff like that. We can't just order two firms to merge and see how that works out. And so, you know, but the fun thing about being social scientists is that people innovate. Right? And so there's sort of new things to study all the time. And often the things that are being talked about in the financial press, aside from being sort of, you know, current and interesting, relate to some of the big picture questions, some of the things that we think about that is important, even, you know, in academic finance. And you can sort of see a way to make a contribution based on something you're reading in the paper. Go to conferences. Go to conferences like this. And listen to the discussant, right? Part of the discussant's job is to put the paper they're discussing in context of the research in the area. And so, you know, one of the things you get from going to a conference that you don't get from just reading the paper is the discussant's thoughts on the paper and putting it in context. And that can lead you to sort of think about how does this fit into the research area, and what are some things that are still left unaddressed. Keep current on SSRN. Obviously, that's, you know, a very good way to keep current on the most current stuff. And also specialize. It's very hard, especially with the sort of maturity to which our our area of study has gotten to sort of dabble across areas and still be able to identify in a lot of different areas what the unresolved topics are and exactly sort of how it relates to the stuff that's gone before. You really sort of need to know what's going on in a particular topic area in order to be able to consistently make contributions in that area. Okay, writing, general advice. Don't write a suspense novel. There's too much of this tendency to build to the big reveal. All right, so that's unrealistic about how papers are read. Another comment I got as a PhD student was, you'll never have as much time for research as you do now, and that is absolutely true. It doesn't get any easier as you get out there and start having to take on more and more responsibilities as a faculty member. And so you need to be realistic about the people who are going to be reading your papers. It is not this ideal world where I get back to my office and say, I've got this 2 hours to just sit down and read this paper from this PhD student. That's not realistic. They don't have these kind of unfettered blocks of time. And a lot of people are going to basically, they read the essay, read the introduction, they're going to start flipping to the tables. They're going to, you need to figure out how to get across what's going on fairly quickly. And also, to the extent that then we can actually, our interest is piqued enough to sort of try to read through the whole paper in some kind of linear fashion. It's just a fact that it's easier for human beings to assimilate complex material when they have the major findings already in mind. So they already sort of know where we're going with this. And obviously this is one of the reasons an introduction is so important. Don't write a diary. This happens a lot with dissertations. It sounds like this complete chronological documentation of everything you did in the last 2 years trying to get to this conclusion. Once you're sort of done with all of the running down all these leads and trying all these things and sort of all the advice you've gotten for different ways to do things, you can go back and sort of rewrite the paper in sort of a more straightforward way, a way that will help your reader get to your conclusions and inferences. Good tables. Tables are very important for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Was that often people will sort of flip right to your tables and start trying to figure out what you're doing, and sometimes you read somebody's paper and then you read their tables and you come to you're like, well, I don't know how they came to those conclusions. I come to a completely different set of conclusions reading their tables. And so, with that said, standalone tables are very important. So you should be able to figure out what's going on in the table without having to read the text that sort of surrounds that table. So you see relatively large legends in the major journals, and that's part of this drive towards standalone tables. And but yet be sparing with tables. So you want to make sure that each table contributes something new in terms of the information to the reader. So one thing I found, and this was particularly true with my dissertation, was that when I put together my job talk, I was presenting some of the results in a different order and sort of motivating some things slightly differently than I had written in the paper. And it was sort of, basically, when you put together a presentation, it's a way to sort of, in effect, start from scratch, which you normally wouldn't just throw out your paper and rewrite it. But you should use the information you get when you sort of try to structure a presentation to improve your paper. I reordered things and sort of motivated things slightly differently after I realized that I was, in the first couple job talks, I was presenting table 8 before table 7. And I thought, well, if I'm going to keep doing this, then maybe that's telling me something about the way I wrote the paper in the first place. Okay, so that's general advice. Now a little bit of nitpicking specific advice, but that sort of makes a difference nonetheless. You need to change some of your writing habits. Okay, so write short sentences. This was something that I had to get used to. We're all reasonably smart people. We're all relatively good with the language. So that what that means is that we can write sentences that are grammatically correct, grammatically consistent, yet complete train wrecks. Nonetheless, in terms of getting a point across or having modifiers that are unclear or ambiguous antecedents and so forth. So, I had to sort of get used to writing shorter sentences, and maybe that means you use a few more transition words, but it also means that it increases the probability that the reader will get from the sentence what you meant to get across from the sentence. Okay? Avoid the passive voice. That's another thing that we sort of, a bad habit we tend to fall into. So you write something like the stock price reaction is partially explained by the firm's cash position. Why not just write the firm's cash position that partially explains the stock price reaction? So just switch it to the active voice. Excess cash is found to explain. I find that excess cash explains. And that's another thing is that, through whatever humility training or something like that, we often have this problem with writing I find, and that's one of the reasons we sort of shift into the passive voice. Or we pretend we're the King of England and write we find, and there's only a single author. So this royal we is floating around crazy. But be willing to write I did this, with some moderation, because it just makes things a little bit more clear in the writing. The trouble with may. So this is, I get papers that use may a lot, and that's sort of a pretty negative signal for me. I didn't mean to have that there, sorry. That was going to be an example, but I don't think I have time for it. Excessive use of may can indicate that the analysis is underdeveloped. Okay, so if you're using this may be this, and this may indicate that, and this may, so that you haven't really thought through what the assumptions are underlying the hypothesis. So if you have clear assumptions, then conditional on that, those assumptions, then this does indicate this. And if you don't get that, then you can say something about the hypothesis. So don't run around saying may all the time in the results, because it indicates that you haven't really thought through the analysis a lot. This is part of the reason we use may is we're trying not to overreach. But the problem with may is that you can put may not in its place without changing the meaning of the sentence, right? And so so what's the point of what you're saying at that point? Okay, use footnotes sparingly. Again, this is the specific advice, the nitpicking. Your dissertation is too long to be submitted to a journal. This is a fact, right? Okay, it's just too long, and so but you want to preserve all these nuggets of brilliance that you've written in your dissertation. So somewhere along the lines you figure out that if you just write them in a smaller font and put them at the bottom of the page, then you can make your dissertation shorter without actually removing anything. But that's a problem, right? So this is not going to make the paper readable or really submittable. And so a rule of thumb is that you've got one footnote per page, you probably have too many. DUA, don't use acronyms. Okay, so we invent acronyms as we're writing because we're lazy, right? So we don't want to keep typing out this thing, or we want to make it a little bit shorter, but that imposes costs on the reader. Again, you're assuming that the person is going to sit down and read the paper linearly and know exactly what this acronym that suddenly shows up on page 10 means, and it's not realistic. And nowadays, with the sort of 8-character limit gone on variable names, there's no reason to have these sort of crazy shortened names of stuff in tables. You can sort of write out what the actual thing is that's in the regression. Okay, so to conclude, hopefully on time, be realistic about your audience. This is the main thing, and how they're going to read the paper. So sit down and think, who's my audience? Am I getting my point across? Why should somebody who doesn't have to read my paper read it? Why would they want to read it? And how can I convince them that they want to read it? How can I get my main point across quickly, make it low cost to the reader, and avoid sort of these rookie writing traps, some of these specific nitpicking things, and some of the bigger picture things. And of course, as always, get as much feedback as possible, because some of your colleagues will sort of point out these writing mistakes that you make, and help increase the probability of a successful publication outcome.